meadow mix is a mix that is designed with wildflower meadows in mind. And so with wildflower meadow, we're thinking of kind of a landscaping application. We're thinking of aesthetics. We want it pretty. If we want it pretty, what is the criteria that we're going to put into designing this mix? Let's explore that. So one of those criteria is height. We don't want our plants too tall. Now, in a wet site where the soils are wet, the plants are just naturally going to get taller. And so for some of the other landscaping mixes, I try to keep the height more down here at waist high. But it starts creeping up when you get into the wet meadow mix because the plants are just taller in a wetter site. That's just part of the reality of it. But let's all agree that, 12 feet is taller than shoulder high. And so the more we can keep it shoulder high, the more tidy, the less tall it is. That's one of the criteria. We want to keep it relatively short. Another criteria is that we want blooms spring through fall. No one plant is going to bloom all the way from spring to fall. More so, you're going to have this plant that blooms here in April and one that blooms in May. And of course, nothing really cares about the calendar months. They might go from May to June or whatever. And then July. And so different things are blooming all through the year so that you've always have a changing palette of colors. You have a changing set of textures, and it's just changing as you go. And that adds to the interest, actually, instead of always having the same plant blooming of the same color. We don't want them too tall. We don't want our plants to just bloom in one season. We want spring through fall. What are the other criteria that we're thinking about when we design this mix? So we want plants that are adapted to moist soils. So we don't want plants that only love it dry in this mix. We don't want plants that love the Goldilocks soils, that mesic soil that's not too wet, not too dry. If it only loves that soil, we don't want it in a wet meadow mix. We want things that love wet soils, love wet feet. And so picking species that fit that characteristic is part of what we're thinking about when we're designing this mix. Another consideration for the design of this mix is that we choose mostly perennial plants to go in this mix. Perennial plants come back from the root system year after year. They're very stable once they're established. Now they do take a little while to get established, but once established, they're steady, they're stable, they're there for the long haul as long as they're adapted and the management is good. And so we've got the perennial plants, but to throw a few of the annuals and biennials in there that come on quick, that come on the first and second years of the planting, can really give you some color, and you can look at that and you can enjoy those as you're waiting for the perennial plants to develop, because they are a little slower. About year 3, a lot of times you start to see those perennial plants developing and starting to show their pretty blooms. So that's what's going through my head when I'm picking species to put into a wet meadow mix. And the species can change from month to month, from year to year that are in the mix, kind of depending upon what's available. But we're always looking back to that original set of criteria to say, does this species fit in this mix or not? Should we leave it out? Those spring blooming wildflowers that might be in this mix would be a bergamot or a white beard tongue. The summer blooming plants might include common black-eyed Susan, prairie blazing star, plains coreopsis, some of the mountain mints. Species that bloom in that fall time period might include brown-eyed Susan, cardinal flower, blue lobelia. So the wet meadow mix is only wildflowers, and we design it that way for a reason. What you can do, because that wildflower mix is separate from the grasses, is you can choose the amount of wildflowers to grasses that you want. And you might be thinking, well, I really only want wildflowers. That's what I'm concerned about. And I'm going to give you a couple reasons why I think you should probably include at least some amount. It doesn't have to be a large amount, but some amount of grasses with your wildflower mix, with your wet meadow mix. So one of those reasons is the grasses, they have this ability to cover the soil better than the wildflowers do. Wildflowers are often like pencils sticking out of the ground, and the grasses have a lot of leaves down here at the ground level. And so those leaves help to discourage weeds from germinating because the sunlight is not hitting the soil. And so if the sunlight's not hitting the soil, then those weed seeds are not encouraged to germinate. And then we just are not seeing the ragweeds, the foxtails, those sort of weeds that we might otherwise be seeing. So that's one reason to include them. Another reason to include the grasses is the fall and winter color, the visual appeal, the visual interest. Some of them have a unique seed head, like the shape of it will hold into the fall. Some of them just have a bright color. And of course, we're not talking bright like the wildflowers blooms, but we're talking like a rusty red color or kind of a brightish orange color. So these grasses can help to lend visual appeal during that season, that dormant season when you don't have a lot of other visual appeal. Another reason to include grasses in a mix would be if you want to do a controlled burn, it'll give you the fuel for that. Now, controlled burns are not required, but they are an excellent tool if you choose to use it. And the wildflowers generally don't have enough leaves down there to carry a fire, just kind of as a whole, as a rule of thumb, or they often don't anyway. And so some of the grasses in there will help with that. And then lastly, some of these grasses can help support the wildflowers in certain situations if they want to get a little tall and lanky. So you can think about the ratio that you want of the grasses to the wildflowers. And a grass mix that really works well with the wet meadow mix is the companion grass mix for wet sites. So that companion grass mix has a lot of the same characteristics that we're looking for in the wet meadow mix itself. We want the plants to be adapted to a wet site. That's of course really imperative, or they're just not going to persist. We also want to make sure that they're not too tall. And so we're choosing those species that are going to help show off the wildflowers, that are not going to be too aggressive, not hide the wildflowers. And so we want the wildflowers to be the focus usually in a landscaping type of mix. So I've mentioned you can vary the ratio of that wet meadow mix and the companion grass mix for wet sites. Why, what ratio is perfect? Well, that's going to depend on your situation. So if you're like, what I really want is beautiful wildflowers, just wildflower meadow, that's what I've got in my mind. Go really heavy on the wildflower component. So go 75% of the mix being the wet meadow mix, 25% of the mix being the companion grass mix for wet sites. Or maybe you're like, oh, I just want a little more balanced mix. Let's go 50-50. And so what you're saying there is that 50% of the plants would be, or 50% of the ground would be covered in the end, should everything kind of go as planned, with the grasses and 50% with the wildflowers. So it's kind of a half and half mix. Or maybe you're like, for a number of reasons, you're like, I want more grasses. So more companion grass mix for wet sites and go less on the wildflower, on the wet meadow mix. And so reasons that you would be over here on this end of the spectrum would include, well, I really like the look of the grasses. I just love the look, the texture of those grasses. And so I want to go heavy on that. That might be one reason you would do it. Another reason would be the grass mix is a little less expensive than the wildflower mix. And so if budget is a concern, sometimes you'll increase the amount of grasses and decrease the amount of wildflowers so that you still have a full, robust, healthy stand of plants, but you don't have, quite the expense in it that you would if you had more wildflowers in it. The place that I think of a wet meadow mix, and we've mentioned it a little bit already, but to just dive into it a little bit more, what site, what situation is ideal for a wet meadow mix? Well, it's wet, right? And so this is the place where you're like, you're walking through the field with your friend that's never been there, and you're like, don't go walk over there because it rained a week ago and that's going to be muddy. Or you're driving through the field and you're like, don't drive over there, we'll get the truck stuck over there. And so it's the place that stays wet longer. This can be on the side of a hill. So the rain goes into the soil, infiltrates into the soil, and then there's a restriction in there, bedrock, fragipan, something like that causes the water to surface. And so it can be on this side of the hill that you've got this seepy spot all of a sudden. So it's dry up here, dry down here, and you've got this seepy spot. So that would be another spot where, again, it's that wet spot on the farm, wet spot on your land. A lot of times at the base of a hill, You kind of flatten out, and some bottoms are quite seepy, quite wet. And again, that moisture from uphill is coming, it's surfacing there, and it's creating a wet spot in the soil. And so basically, all I'm doing is I'm saying you're looking for the sites that are wet. Sometimes that's a whole area that you're going to plant. And sometimes the situation is really that it's a little niche, little area, microsite in your planting. And so it may even be appropriate sometimes to plant, the rest of it may be quite dry or quite mesic. And you plant like the dry and rocky mix or the prairie patchwork mix on most of it, but this one little site is quite moist. And so don't be scared to zone your planting if that's what you find is appropriate when you start thinking about your soils. I will also mention that this mix is not really for standing water for like long periods of time. If it's standing for a week or maybe 2, that's not much of a concern. But if we've got like water ponded over it, then we're really looking at wetland plants. Like we're in a whole different suite of plants there. We're really thinking here in the wet meadow mix about grassland plants that just like to have wet feet, wet soils, but they don't like to be covered with water. If you're ready to plant, or maybe you're just even ready to consider how to go about getting something established, we have a lot of resources on our website that can help you out. There are establishment timelines to know how to go from the place where you're at to the place where you want to go. There's guides for how to get good seed to soil contact, how to scatter seed, and many, many more. So check that out. And here at Hamilton Native Outpost, one of our passions is really to get a mix designed that serves a need for people, that is really that mix that is going to carry them to reach their goals. What they're wanting from this planting is, in the design of this mix. And so I hope that today we've been able to share some of the theory behind this mix so that you know if it's a good one for your situation or not.